Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. I thank everyone for joining us on this lovely Friday evening, or whatever day or time it is where you're tuning in from. My name is Lee Pfeffer. I am the Manager of Museum Experience with the Glbt Historical Society, and I'm going to introduce this program tonight and also moderate our Q&A segment. Again, I thank you for joining us tonight. And before we dive into our actual program with our wonderful host this evening, I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about the Glbt Historical Society. I also want to acknowledge that the Glbt Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land, and I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous peoples. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website. If you're watching live along with us, we welcome your active participation in the chat, and we encourage you to post comments, observations, and especially questions for our host this evening. Before I turn it over, let me tell you a little bit of history about our organization and the work that we do. Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public knowledge and materials that support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. We have two centers of operation. We have the Glbt Historical Society Museum located in the heart of the Castro, which is, we're on 18th Street between Castro and Collingwood, and we've been open since 2011 in that space. And we have the Dr. John P. DeCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. Please check out our growing array of resources, exhibitions, events, archival collections, all of those online on our website at glbthistory.org. And finally, I want to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you're not already a card-carrying member of the Glbt Historical Society, I invite you to consider joining today. Members get a variety of cool perks, including a 20% discount on swag from our gift shop, both in the store, in the museum, as well as online. You get access to special members-only events, and you also get free admission to the museum for yourself and a guest. You can learn more about how to become a member and other ways that you can support the Society and our work by visiting glbthistory.org/join-give. And now I would love to introduce our speaker tonight. Laura Hall was born and raised in a small city on the San Francisco Peninsula. After receiving her BA and MA in landscape architecture at the University of California at Berkeley, she went on to teach for the school's extension program and build an urban design professional practice where her projects included community facilitation in Northern California communities and rebuilding plans for Mississippi Gulf Coast towns following the devastating effects of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. She currently works in the EPA's Region 9 Tribal Intergovernmental and Policy Division in San Francisco. And tonight, she's going to be discussing her new book that is titled Affliction, Growing Up with a Closeted Gay Dad. So let me bring Laura on to say hi. Hello.
Hi, Lee. Thank you so much.
Hi. How's it going tonight?
It's going well. I just want to say how honored I am actually to be doing my first book reading here at the museum virtually. I've attended many book readings in the museum over the years and met some of my dearest friends, many of whom were children of gay fathers, some closeted, some not, some in various stages, and we're all of different generations. And we formed a very strong bond over the years, and they helped me get through my writing journey. And I owe it to the museum. So thank you for that, Lee.
Oh, well, thank you. We're actually really happy. We're really happy to have you here. And some folks who are watching may not actually know that we are having you back right now. You actually came into you came into our periphery last year, or I guess I've completely
I
lost track
know.
of time. It was either late 2019 or very early 2020. I think it was late 2019 when, we had this wasn't yet a book, but you were there to tell your story. And so I'm really excited to hear how things have evolved. And so you're going to do a couple of readings for us, and we have some visuals, and then I would love to turn it over to the folks in our audience to ask some questions. I might be able to ask some questions as well. So folks, if you, while you are watching, have anything that you would like to ask Laura or have any comments, observations, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will be able to throw them up on the screen when we start our Q&A segment. So yeah, let me turn it over to you, Laura, and I'll be still here back in the background running the slides, and I hope everyone enjoys.
Thank you, Lee. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. As I said, Lee's going to put the first slide up, and we'll get started. There we go. Again, my book is called Affliction. That is a term of my father's. After he came out to me and he was telling me his stories about his life over the years, he used that word when he described how he felt as a schoolboy, knowing he was different, but he couldn't figure out what it was, and he considered it an affliction of some kind. He didn't do that. He didn't feel that way as an adult, but that's where that came from. As Lee said, I was born to a gay father and a straight mother in 1951. I'm the second of four children, four baby boomers born after the war. Next slide, Lee. My parents met in 1942. They were married then. My father was in the Army, and he was set to embark from the Presidio to the Aleutian Islands, where he would eventually spend 4 years during World War II. But the Presidio was full in San Francisco, and so they housed his unit on the San Francisco Peninsula in Belmont, near where my mother lived. And there was a USO dance that they had, I guess it was announced to all the soldiers and to the young women at the high school. My mother was actually a high school senior, and that's where they met at a USO dance in San Carlos. And my mother was dancing with the company cook named Pete. I heard about Pete a lot in my life. My mom said she felt sorry for him because she went off and danced with my dad. But when my father and his buddy walked in the door, his friend said, "Hey, Hall, let's get out of here. There are no girls to dance with." Well, that turned my mom's eyes on him, and she said that he saw his big blue eyes and white teeth and how handsome he was. And she said, she always had a really sweet voice. She said, "I'll dance with you." And he looked towards her, and he was smitten with her red hair and her sweet voice. And so he stayed. I think his friend left, but he stayed, and they danced. And she was 17-year-old high school senior. He was 24. So it was spring of 1942. And my father then went off to war, and he just happened to get a furlough in September of that year. He came back for a week, and they married. This picture of my mother on the left with that wild hairdo was not at the dance. That was something my father did after he got married. He loved styling her hair, and he insisted that all us kids call it Tishan blonde and not red. I think he thought red was just too simple. So anyway, let's see what else. Next slide, Lee. I was born, I know I came into the world anxious and insecure, and always looking around, trying to figure out what was going on. The world didn't make a lot of sense to me. And this photo on the right, I'm going to read a passage about where I am in that photo and how old I am. I'm perhaps 18 months old. My vantage point is low to the ground. The house is dark except for a thin line of light under the kitchen door. a sign my father hasn't yet left. I toddle down the hallway toward the light. A few feet shy of the kitchen door, I tuck myself under one of the dining room chairs, keeping my eye focused on the bright yellow line. The gurgling of the percolator and the tick, tick, ticking of the toaster calm me, but my stomach clutches at the sounds of running water and dishes clanking in the sink that follow. The light switch clicks. The light goes out. The back door latches close. He's gone. I think over the years, thinking about all this, I think I never felt like my father completely belonged to us, that he also belonged to someone else. So that's where a lot of my insecurity came from. Next slide, Lee. My father and I were always close from the very beginning. We seemed to be able to speak a common language. We enjoyed this, and we appreciated the same things. He loved to do crafts. He taught me how to make paper chains out of his cigarette wrappers. I just found him to be so interesting. I would watch him in the yard landscaping. He taught me how to do calligraphy. None of my siblings were that interested in it, but he and I had a real ease with each other. And I'm going to read you this passage about the picture on the left. That's me leaning down, and my little toddler sister looking out at the waves, and my younger brother and older sister are off somewhere. It was foggy and windy when we arrived one day. This was not unusual for Northern California beaches. We'd keep our shoes on that day. Dad eyed something in the swash zone and squatted down. He waved us over, warning us to keep one eye on the rough surf. Come see the sand crabs, kids. Hurry before the next wave hits. And there they were, tiny gray-shelled creatures burrowing into the sand as a wave retreated back to the sea. For my father's excitement, it seemed he felt that nature was putting on a show just for him, a most appreciative audience of one. He was often that way about things he was really interested in. I was curious about the crabs and his other finds at the beach, but never quite as excited as he was. His enthusiasm was enough to fill up the space all around us. Soon the soft-shelled crabs scrambled from view. My siblings had dispersed too. But look, Lori, he said, pointing with a stick. See those indentations in the sand? They can't completely hide. I didn't understand how the crabs could survive underground, but Dad assured me they were safe where they were. They'd come out again when they felt safe, perhaps when the next wave hit, cloaking them in foam and making them invisible to predators. Next slide, Lee. So this is me at age 24, the year my father came out to me. As you can see, I'm still, and to this day, rather tentative, looking around my world, like not really knowing what's going on, a little anxious, like what's going on. I had been through multiple relationships. I was a teen mom. I was struggling, and I wanted to pin my bad behavior in terms of relationships on someone, and so I thought he'd be a good one to do that with. The following weekend was Father's Day, and he asked me to come out and take a walk with him and our dog Daisy. And I figured, well, that was my chance to ask him some hard questions. So I will read that passage. It's a little longer. My father and I and Daisy, the Yappy Terrier, took off up the hills behind the family house. This was down in San Carlos on the peninsula. I remember the sky as being a light blue, but the summer haze lower on the horizon partially obscured our view of the San Francisco Bay. Dad and I bantered about not much at all, as I recall. Perhaps the long, hot summer that year. the dry vegetation surrounding us, and the unnatural looking pinkish orange color of the Leslie salt evaporation ponds in the bay below us. Behind the small talk, though, my mind churned. I hadn't planned it, but now seemed like as good a time as ever to ask the question that had pressed on me since I was little. I was desperate for the truth, though I already had my suspicions. Still, I hoped hearing out loud would help me make sense of the mess I'd made of my own life. At 24, I'd already been through a teen pregnancy, 2 marriages, multiple extramarital affairs, and was now working on my second divorce. I hoped to finally point the finger at someone other than myself. I'd spent at least 2 decades following the clues my father left behind. After weighing the evidence and knitting together a story that would hopefully explain away my own shortcomings, I readied myself for the final proof. When we reached the ridgeline and Dad unleashed Daisy, I made my move. Have you ever been unfaithful to Mom? Looking back now, I'm shocked by my boldness. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I could feel my heart pounding against my snug powder blue poor boy top. I regretted saying them. I already knew the answer. Daisy by then had disappeared into the scrubby manzanitas, her scruffy brown head bobbing up and down like a free-range jackrabbit. I wished I could disappear with her, but it was too late. There was no retracting my question. Dad alternated his gaze from my eyes to the view of Mount Diablo behind me. When his cheeks turned a reddish purple and he drew in a large breath, letting it out slowly, I assumed he was stunned by my courage. I'd stunned myself. He then broke out in the same guilty-looking grin he had on his face that scandalous evening on Birch Avenue when I was about 6. In the after hours of a dinner party my parents hosted, I caught him red-handed in the living room with one of the other wives. My parents used to have these big dinner parties, and the wives always liked my dad. Living room with one of the other wives, her bright red lipstick mouth pressed conspiratorially up to his left cheek. "Honey, I'm gay," Dad said, jolting me back to the present. His voice was disturbingly cheery. When I didn't immediately respond, he repeated himself, this time with emphasis. "I've always been gay." I did want to say that wasn't the question I asked, but I didn't. My stomach clutched. Behind him stood a glaring sun, but oddly his face wasn't in shadow. Rather, it glowed a shiny bronze, a phenomenon that to this day I can't explain. His big blue eyes sparkled more than usual, and his breath came out in short staccato bursts. After keeping his secret from nearly everyone for more than 5 decades, a fact I'd soon glean, he appeared gleeful to unburden himself to me. Even in my state of shock, it was clear to me that the weight of his secret, or some of the weight of his secret, had shifted from his shoulders to mine. So what happened after that, next slide, Lee, is that stories started pouring out of him for the next, well, actually for the rest of my life, but things I didn't know. He grew up in the Central Valley oil fields in a state designated place. It wasn't even a town, called Fellows. His parents were part of a community, tight-knit community in Missouri that had migrated out here for the oil jobs. They called them black gold. And it was a really tough time for everyone. And so there were a lot of jobs here and they migrated out here. It was a very conservative community, very Southern Baptist, homophobic, racist. My father's the taller boy here. He is, and his father is right behind him in the oil stain coveralls. He was a oil field roustabout. And my father said at the age he was in that photo, he already knew he was attracted to those of the same sex. And he didn't have a word for it. He also knew that he should conceal it. As he went through grade school, he liked to perform in plays. He was a great student. Unfortunately, his teachers passed him 2 grades, which made it harder on him socially. He was regularly beat up by the other boys in the class. He'd go eat his lunch out by the garbage can, a little alcove behind the school. And after school was over, he would run down the hill to his home, and the boys would be chasing him with stones. And they would stone him on his way home, and he told himself he had to just make sure he stayed standing, because if he fell, he knew how much worse it would be. He was pretty popular in high school, especially with the girls. He was a great dancer. You can see he was very handsome, and he was tall, and the boys didn't bully him anymore. He was engaged to a woman in high school, and they had planned to get married after high school, but he got increasingly depressed about that idea and even suicidal. So he decided to go out to the coast to visit his grandmother named Fanny, who lived over there during the hot summers of the Central Valley. And she was the kindest person he'd ever known, and he sought her help. And she told him what a lot of gay people hear when they come out: God loves all his children, which isn't everything, but it's something. And she told him that, I mean, she never judged him at all. She just loved him. She encouraged him to go back to church, to go back to this, the Southern Baptist conservative church, which he didn't want to do. But she said there was a new preacher in town, and that she thought he would really feel better after listening to him talk. And so he started going to church, and he met the preacher, and he was overwhelmed, he said, by how articulate and charismatic he was. And it turns out also he was gay. And I don't think my great grandmother knew that, or maybe she did. But he ended up, Jack, his name was Jack, and he had come to Fellows from the Midwest by way of Los Angeles, and had met a lot of people in the gay community down there. And he said he would like to introduce my dad to a man, an older man named Clarence, and other members of the gay community down there. So that's what they did. Let's see. What else? So next slide, Lee. Jump in right into this. Jack introduced my father to Clarence, and we always thought he was our uncle because that's when we referred to him. He was an older man, maybe 20 years older than my dad, and turns out he was a mentor for young gay men who really didn't know how to live in this world. This was 1937, and he was a music teacher, and he immediately liked my dad, and he wanted to introduce him to one of his his piano students, and his name was Stanley. There he is on the left. My dad is on the right. And they ended up falling in love. And let me see, I have a passage here to read. The year was 1937. My father was 19 at the time. Clarence, 53, told him he had someone he wanted him to meet, one of his piano students. I'd never heard this story before, nor any of the other stories that were now pouring out of my father on a regular basis. I'll never forget it, honey, Dad said. As soon as I got out of the car, I looked at him, he looked at me, and it just clicked. Oh God, I told myself. If love at first sight is possible, it happened to me then. His name was Stanley. Though I didn't want him to hide any of these stories from the past, I didn't know what to do with them. My parents were still married to each other. My mother didn't know I knew that Dad was gay, although he'd eventually tell her. Her romantic love at first sight story was all about my dad. My father's love at first sight story wasn't about her, though. It was about Stanley. From that point on, Dad said, he and Stanley got together as often as they could. During a one-week vacation, they stayed with his grandmother, Fanny, out at the coast. They began thinking about how they could spend their lives together. Stan was starting college. The 125 miles between Fellows and Los Angeles seemed insurmountable, especially because neither of them had a car. I realized that this was what I wanted, Dad said. I decided to go back to school. Clarence told me that I could live with him and go to Pasadena City College, which I did. His goal was to become an English teacher. The two maintained their relationship during that time. Dad started college, lived in Alhambra, and took the trolley out to Pasadena on school days. I was very excited about being back in school, he said. For a time, my father was in a loving relationship with another man, the result of his talk with my great-grandmother, Fanny, who died 2 years before I was born. I wish I had somebody like her when I was struggling. I was now the one asking if there was anyone else in the world like me, someone with a gay father and a straight mother. In the past, Dad had been my version of Fanny, someone who was always available to me, willing to listen to my stories and problems for as long as it took. But now his stories, not mine, dominated our conversations. They poured out of him. I closeted my anxiety over his secret, which was now my secret. Neither of my parents knew my struggles during this time. Migraines and nightmares of being in a small space with the walls closing in were a constant for me now. Dad's affliction had become mine. Well, what happened after my dad actually had 2 arrests at this time for being gay. One was at a party in the Hollywood Hills with musicians and producers and movie and actors, and it was quite an affair. Someone must have called the police on them because they came to the door, knocked loud, barged in, and dragged all of these men there into a paddy wagon and took them to jail. For some reason, the arresting officer couldn't absolutely say with certainty that my father was touching another man when he was dancing with, and because they hadn't touched, they couldn't arrest him. My dad said he saw a lot of kindness in this officer's eyes. He thought, well, maybe I always thought, I wonder if he was gay himself. But anyway, my dad got off that time, but there was another arrest. He was caught up in a sting operation targeting gay men by the Pasadena Police Department. And this time it was much more serious, and it turned into an extortion scheme. It was quite a big deal until the LA Times revealed it on the front page of the newspaper many months later. But at that point, my father was terrified that he would be imprisoned forever if something happened again, or worse. And he ended up leaving Stanley and leaving Clarence, moving back to Fellows. And he wrote a letter to Clarence and Stanley saying he could no longer handle the horrors of being queer. So he went back into the closet pretty much forever. And let's see. Okay, next slide. So here's a picture of on the right side, the 4 of us kids, us baby boomers. I'm the middle child in that one, and I'm the younger child in the first one. That was the year that my mother found out about my father. And I didn't know this. I just had a lot of problems that year, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. And I'm going to read about it. It was 1957. I was 6 years old. And the only way that I could be comforted was in the middle of the night when I had night terrors and stomach aches, was to be brought into their bed and be in the middle of them. And if I could touch both of them at the same time, I felt safe. So I obviously knew what was going on. I didn't know it consciously. But I will go ahead and read that passage. Hey, Dad, can I ask you another question? He turned his head towards me. Sure, honey, anything. What happened the day Mom found out? He had told me earlier that Mom knew he was gay. Dad pursed his lips. I thought he either looked embarrassed or ashamed, but he may have just been nervous. Then his expression changed. He relaxed. His face glistened. He pulled a pack of cigarettes out of his shirt pocket, tapped it on the bottom to release one, and lit it. After taking a long draw, he guided me over to the 2 patio chairs that faced the cypress trees on the bank of the back hill. This was in San Carlos. We sat there in silence until he stubbed out his cigarette in a flower pot at his feet. Well, honey, he said, and my father always spoke very slow. Well, honey, he said, she called me at work. She was hysterical. I grimaced. She said I should come home immediately, he said. I could tell it was bad. I thought something had happened to one of you kids. I raced home. Dad described his every movement while I tapped my feet on the grain slats of the deck. He described how he sped down the freeway, pulled into the driveway, bolted out of the car, ran into the house and shouted, Irene, Irene. But the house was quiet. The kitchen and dining room were empty. He rounded the corner of the living room to the hallway leading to their bedroom. Your mother was lying on the bed crying. The evidence, the photos spread out all around her, he said. He fanned his arms out as he spoke. This is hard to read. There were razor blades by her side, he said, trailing off. I turned away from him, taking myself to task for asking yet another question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I tried not to think of my mother just 20 feet away from me on the other side of the sliding glass door. What photos, Dad? I couldn't even think about the razor blades, let alone ask about them. Well, some of the neighborhood men and I, he hesitated. What, Dad? Now I just wanted him to get it over with. Well, we'd get together in one of the fellows' garages. One of the men was a photographer. Your mother broke the lock on the box of photos. I ran my hands through my hair and wondered why I was doing this to myself again. Images of my father cavorting, possibly naked, with other men in a neighbor's garage while I was a 6-year-old playing tetherball in the backyard horrified me. I couldn't even imagine what seeing the revealing photos had done to my mother. Well, honey, I went all to pieces, he said. I acted like an idiot. I blamed her for invading my privacy. You blamed her? I yelled at her. I said, why? Why would you do this to me, Irene? I wanted to say, but she wasn't doing anything to you, Dad. But I didn't. I was afraid he'd stop talking. I wanted to know everything. I told her I'd come back after you kids were in bed. I'd pack up my things and be out of her life for good. I would send her every penny I ever earned for her and you kids for the rest of my life. I promised her she would never have to see me again. I told her I was very sorry and I left. I guess that meant he didn't plan to see us kids again either. I remembered my night terrors and stabbing stomach aches that first year we lived in the old house in town. It was that year. He came home that night, he said, and packed up his things. I imagined myself at the time asleep in my room as he backed out of the driveway. He was on the verge of leaving us, maybe for good. It was dark, he said, and as he backed out of the driveway, he saw my mother. She was running toward him, tears streaming down her face. He stopped the car, leaving the ignition on, and got out. Your mother threw her arms around me and said, please, Ralph, please don't leave. I still love you. Dad leaned over to remove a flat weed with sharp spikes on it from a small planter between our chairs. He dropped it on the warm redwood deck so it wouldn't reseed somewhere else. After taking one last draw from the now short stub of his second cigarette, he leaned over again, extinguished the burning butt in the planter, and left it there to decompose. He stood up slowly and faced me, leaning his head to one side. His shoulders were soft. So I turned off the ignition. I got my things out of the trunk and went back into the house. We agreed never to speak of it again. I stared at him without saying a word. This was a lot to process. And here we are, he said. Yes, Dad, here we are. So that was that. That was a tough time for all of us. Okay, so next slide, Lee. So my parents went on with their lives. They ended up having more or less separate lives, although they were very kind to each other and devoted in many ways, but they're not romantically. My mother sang in the church choir. She traveled with girlfriends, and my father was now working in San Francisco, and he was going through his bohemian phase, and he was gone more and more. He was never out overnight, except for one time. And he'd disappear on the weekends. He'd come home with a tattoo of a rose on his wrist. He embroidered shirts that he wore. He made leather purses for my mother, which her girlfriends loved, and they all wanted to buy some from my dad. They just went on. My parents just were always just facing forward. Let's see, what else do I have? But my dad always did have a double life. At some point, he had a boyfriend, and I actually met him. That's in the book. That was hard. But also when AIDS hit, he did not get AIDS. He actually lived to be 90, but he was an AIDS buddy for many of his friends who were sick. So they had their lives. He also started an LGBT section in the Belmont Library. The librarian had gotten frustrated with him requesting so many books, and she said, "Mr. Hall, why don't you just set up that section?" So he did that. And what's interesting is he didn't really hide it from us, but for my siblings who didn't know he was gay, it was just our dad. He was always very progressive. He was always different than the other dads on the block. We were used to him doing these kinds of things, and certainly helping other people. So none of it was surprising to anyone in the family. Anyway, let's see. Let's go to the next slide, Lee. These are the last photos of my mom and my dad. My mother on the left, she was 82, and she would die, that was Christmas, and she would die 4 months later at age 82. She always, you could see how happy she was. She loved family, she loved Christmas, she loved presents, and she always adored my father. And my last, when she was dying, I embedded myself in her room with her. She and my mom had separate bedrooms, and it was obviously she was going to be dying very soon. And so I'm going to read that scene that includes, let's see, here we go. On what would be my mother's final evening, I could tell she wouldn't last much longer. This is another one that's hard to read. She hadn't spoken for more than 24 hours. I planted myself at her bedside. The night sky outside was dark, and the lights in her room were low. As far as I knew, my father hadn't been in her room even once that day. Other family members had come to the house, and they were all out in the kitchen and living room, and he was hosting them and entertaining them. I wondered if my parents might end up this way, apart at the very end. I willed myself not to intervene. It was their marriage, I told myself, their lives. It was time for me to let go of the fable. I needn't have worried. Dad, in his dramatic fashion, must have had it planned out the whole time. As I filled my glass with water in the kitchen, I watched as my father lumbered down the dim hallway to Mom's room, bent over his cane. Maybe he'd been waiting for me to leave the room. I hadn't considered that. I tiptoed behind him. I didn't want to interrupt anything, but I longed to see my parents together for what I knew would be their last time. Dad walked straight to Mom's pink tufted vanity stool next to her bed. I told myself to leave then, that they deserved privacy with their final goodbyes, but I couldn't tear myself away from the doorway. Dad leaned in close to her and placed his tremoring hand on top of one of hers. He called her by the nickname she went by more than 6 decades earlier, her name the night they met. Rusty, he said. His voice was sing-song sweet, sounding as if he were speaking to a child. I wonder if that was how he felt. Maybe he always felt that way about her. My mother grew up without a father, and I think my father did play that role for her in many ways. Mom didn't open her eyes or even stir. I am so glad you said yes, Dad said. It was a story I'd heard so many times in my life about his telegram from Seattle in 1942 with the words, "Marry me, dearest." "I'd do it all over again," Mom said. Even from the doorway, I could hear my mother's statement loud and clear. Dad jerked his head up. He may not have expected her to say anything. I certainly didn't expect this response. After all, she had recently told me that she wouldn't do it again if she had known Dad was gay. But he promised to spend the rest of his life with her, and he had kept his promise. Was this Mom's way of acknowledging that, or was it as simple as her love for him even now? Her words to Dad were her last. Well, nearly. Either my father, with his diminished hearing, couldn't understand her, or maybe he didn't believe what he'd heard. "What did you say, Irene?" He leaned in closer to her. This time she gave it all she had. I'd do it all over again. She said it really loud, and she hadn't spoken in 24 hours. She was loud and almost insistent in tone. She wanted him to hear her. Those were her last words. Those were the last words I heard my mother speak, that she'd do it all over again. Dad's loud sobs jolted me. I hurried down the hallway to family and friends in the kitchen, tears streaming down my face. She said she'd do it all over again. The startled looks on their faces startled me in return. Here I was, sleep deprived, already grieving for my mother, and now in middle age, acting like an insecure child. No one said a word. Nevertheless, I felt elated knowing that my mother did not regret her life. On the other hand, maybe she just wanted Dad to believe that, to know he hadn't hurt her. Either way, I witnessed this tender love scene between my parents in my mother's final hours. Okay, and now on to my father. After my mother passed, I'd asked him a number of questions at the end, of course, always asking my parents questions. And I asked him what was the biggest regret of his life. And he said that it was that he didn't try harder to lead a life with that young man, Stanley Hughes. Those were exactly his words. And I was looking at all these photos were in our family photo albums all my life, but of course I didn't even realize who they were until after my father died. But this one photo on the right is what's called a double exposure, when two photos are printed at the same time. It's the only photo I have of the two of them. Obviously, in 1937, they wouldn't have been able to ask someone to take sort of photos of the two of them looking loving and adoringly at each other. But I'd been thinking about this in my life, and I knew that actually 15 years after my father came out to me, while he was still alive, I knew that I did not want to sequester myself in safe relationships, safe marriages, like my father had done. I'd always done that. I was so afraid to love too much and then be hurt too much. And next slide, Lee. So I ended up actually meeting the love of my life 30 years ago, and I went for it. I said, no matter how hard it is, how scared I am, I'm going to go for it. And let's see, I have some notes. So we ended up being together for 20 years before I felt comfortable enough, safe enough to marry. I realized that we look like my parents. Anyway, We ended up getting married in 2009 under the gold dome of the San Francisco City Hall at Christmas time, where the first gay marriages in California took place. And we're still happy all these years later. And the last thing I'd like to say is my father's final words to me. He was in the hospital and he would be dying the next day. And he was already starting to transition and, you know, seeing things, and was confusing for me. But at one point he asked Lewis to move just a little, my husband, and so he could see the hospital. My father was always obsessed with time, accurate time, clocks, dictionaries. He always wanted everything to just be so clear and articulate. And so he was looking at the big ugly plastic wall clock on the hospital wall that his bed was facing. And he said, "Lori, turn it back." And I looked at him, I said, "What are you talking about, Dad?" And he said, "Turn it back, turn it back." And I said, "Okay, Dad, I will." But he could tell I was kind of shining him on. And he said, "I mean it. Turn the big hand back." And I said, "Okay, Dad, I will. I promise I will." And then after he died, 2 years after he died, I began to write his story from the very beginning. And then over time, it became my story too. So as my dad would say, here we are, getting a little emotional here. So that's it. Lee, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much for sharing, Laura. I know that's an emotional story for you to tell.
Thank you.
Let's see. So yeah, if anyone has any questions or observations that they would love to share with us, please feel free to put them in the chat. I know we're on the tiniest bit of a delay, but feel free to put them in there. I had a couple of questions that came up that I would love to chat about with you. First off, I think it would be really interesting for everyone to hear kind of your own journey with taking this story and your own experiences from what you started at, which was, telling stories to your friends and turning it into kind of, a blog, things that you were kind of, collecting your thoughts, and the more you learned about your father. Tell us about kind of the process from that into, deciding this needs to be.
Oops, you went on mute.
My microphone has been doing a lot of disconnecting on its own, so I saw that. Whoop. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the process, from there to book, and what is different now than the last time that we spoke with you and you shared your story.
Well, after my father died, after my parents were both gone, and I started going through his things, his photo albums, their letters. My mom had saved every single letter he'd written to her during the war. And I started getting deeper and deeper into their story, and also angrier and angrier at the world we lived in, or they lived in at the time, that forced this upon them. And about 2 years after my dad died, I just felt this strong urge to start writing something. I didn't think I was going to be writing about my dad. I didn't know what was burning inside me, but something was. And I picked up a writing book at a bookstore near where I worked on Market Street here in San Francisco. And I was reading it on BART, and this old man was eavesdropping over my shoulder. We were standing up as a crowded train, and that's not something people normally do. And he said, she teaches classes right here in San Francisco at her house. It was Adair Lara, a longtime columnist of the San Francisco Chronicle, who my dad actually just loved. He used to cut out her articles and mail them to me wherever I lived. And so I signed up for her class. And the first writing prompt she gave us was write for 10 minutes nonstop. don't lift your pen, about your, and the title of this prompt is My Dad's Clothes. And so I was writing it, and I just saw this, you know, my dad's beautiful closet with all his beautiful suits and his hankies and his ties and his fancy hats and fancy shoes. He had beautiful clothes, and how, you know, they were all lined up and categorized, and just in about 5 minutes time, it turned into my dad's closet. I was thinking about literally closeting himself and then me closeting myself, but mostly this was all about him. So for the first, I started writing essays on my blog. I started reading every book I could get my hands on. I went to the, Adair suggested that we go to bookstores and libraries and just see what the comps are for the type of book we want to write or we're writing. And so I did that. And one of the places I went to was the James Hormel LGBTQ Center in the San Francisco, the main library. And I asked the clerk there if he could point me to the section of books written by children of closeted parents. And he kind of shot me a look. This was like 2000, I don't know, this was 10 years ago. And he said, well, why don't you browse and come back in a few minutes? So I did, and I went back, and he said, yeah, there aren't none. There aren't any. And, or any that he could find. So I went to the bookstore out at the Haight Booksmith and asked them there, and I actually talked to the owner, and she did some research in the back room and looked through the computer files and whatever, and she came back and she said, you know, that's a really short shelf. I thought, okay, I'd never heard that term before. And she actually couldn't show me one book. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write this story. So it was like a biography of my dad, and it was like about civil rights, gay rights, a lot of anger. And I had a writing coach at one point who had read my draft, and she said, but where's Laura in here? And I never thought about that, Lee. I never thought that this was really my story too. I was so focused on my parents. You could tell from what I write and how I feel about them. And then it became about me, and it evolved, and it's healed my life too, in the process. So I don't know, that's a long-winded answer, Lee.
No, it's interesting. I mean, that brings up, I think that it brings up an interesting question. Is I'm curious to hear from you kind of what your own reception has been among the LGBTQ community. Obviously, you know, we've had organizations like PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, around for a long time that have been really instrumental in the community. What has your reception been as someone who is, you know, a straight person, as an ally, but is so inextricably tied to this community? And what role do you see yourself and others playing? You know, you're in such a unique position that in some ways isn't so unique at all, because of, you know, the things that so many queer people have had to do in maintaining safety in their lives.
That's a really good question, Lee, because it's awkward for me, because I'm not gay, and some people think at first that I'm angry at my father, which, if anyone knows me or has read anything I've written, knows that's not the case at all. And I did give a talk at PFLAG, the national convention in, where was it? In Texas. Sorry, in Nashville a few years ago. And I don't know, it's an awkward position. I tend to ally myself with any civil rights organization and gay rights, but I always feel a little bit like an interloper too. I don't know, I'm gonna have to figure out how to deal with that a little better. But I think of all the baby boomers, millions and millions of baby boomers that were born right after the war, 4 years of pent-up frustration and fear and anxiety. And they came home and they had, between 3 and 6 kids on average. And a lot of those men came back and they were the men forced into straight marriages if they wanted to have any life at all. They couldn't get any benefits from the GI Bill if they were a gay couple. They couldn't get low-cost mortgages. They would get arrested if they were in public. And I think of all those children. There must be millions of children like me alive today, baby boomers, who I think if they read my book, they might see something that might trigger something in them, like, oh, maybe that was why he was gone so much, or the marriage didn't seem right. Anyway, I'd love to, and most of them will never know if their fathers were gay, because they would go to their graves with that secret. So it's an interesting question. Maybe you have some advice for me.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer the question that I've asked. I think, doing things like this and, kind of creating a community around these specific experiences. I think our good friend Gerard Koskovich has a really great question that I wanted to throw up is, collections of papers documenting relationships of the sort that your parents had among just ordinary people, mid-20th century, they're really scarce in our collections. And I think that it's really important that we, document and preserve those stories. So Gerard is asking, have you thought about donating your parents' papers and photos to our organization or another archive? What do you see, your parents' story as being a part of queer history?
I think it's a story that needs to be told and remembered and documented. I really do, because there aren't that many of us writing these stories. And especially from that time. And Gerard, I think that's an excellent suggestion. I hadn't even thought about that. I have so many things. My bookshelves are full. My files are full. I really like that. I'll have to check with my child and my grandchildren and my siblings, but I would love to think that they'd find a permanent home in the museum. That makes me very teary thinking about that, and also how thrilled my father would be knowing that. Yeah, thank you, Gerard, as always.
Yeah, I wanted to ask how much, if anything, of kind of gay life, gay history, queer history, did you know about outside of just your father's stories before, really digging into your father's history, especially after he passed? Like, what did you know before, and what has learning about that changed about your life and the way that
you ask such good questions?
It's almost as if I do this for my job.
Right? I felt like I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I read the Chronicle. I knew about pride parades. When I was in high school, there was nothing. This was the early '60s. There were no gay clubs or anything. I feel like I knew the surface. I come from a family of very loving, accepting, kind parents and grandparents, and so I have that in me. But I feel like I didn't really know. I didn't know. That's why I got so riled up after my dad died, and I went through his photo albums. These things had been in our house at eye level to me as a child all my life, and I'd never even asked him what was in there. And yeah, I learned a lot, and just by having friends now who are queer and participating in, like, where I work in the LGBT month, giving talks, and most of my friends are young, and I just learn a lot from them. And I feel like I didn't know anything really, except that I was always open and kind and fair. I just came from that. I was born into that. But as to what the horrors, except during the AIDS years, that was really rough for me as a child of a gay man who worked in San Francisco. And it was early on, when he started telling me that his friends are getting this thing called the gay cancer. So it hadn't even been named yet. And I thought, oh my gosh, what does this mean? And how come no one is helping them? And the government is ignoring them. And my dad would volunteer to help with the Shanti Project, and people across the street from us housed the sick men who didn't have a home to go to. And even my mother just loved the gay couple across the street who was housing them. And yeah, I just got little bits and pieces. I lived in a way, a very sheltered life, but in a family that was very open and accepting and loving of all people.
Yeah, and I imagine, kind of digging into your, father's letters, albums, all of that. Did that give you kind of a more comprehensive view of that? What has been, some of the most surprising or illuminating things that you've learned? I mean, I'm sure it was, I'm sure it was really something to learn. For example, that your father was arrested in a sting. I can't imagine what that would have felt like learning about that.
Yeah, it was horrible. And he would talk to us, my brother and me, actually, at the end, about this article that exposed this, because he was going down to Los Angeles once a week by bus from Fellows and paying this hefty fee in 1940 to a fake psychiatrist who was supposedly going to heal all these men. And as long as they kept coming to this session and forking over these fees, which the LA Times later figured out were being split between the judge and the arresting officers and the fake psychiatrist, I had no idea these things could happen. And the more I learned, the angrier I got. My father he wasn't someone that complained ever, or of course didn't talk about a lot of these things in the family. But what he went through and that he survived, that's what shocks the hell out of me. And that he lived to be 90, and he was a decent man all those years. And I don't know, so he talked about, he was back in Fellows with his family. He'd given up school, knew he couldn't be a teacher in California. He told his parents he had to drop out because he was sick, and he looked pretty sick because he was depressed. And he said that one day he went on the front porch. They subscribed to the LA Times, and there it was on the top step, top of the fold, that they had exposed this extortion scheme. And they didn't put all the details in the article, but then he knew he was free. One thing I didn't mention is that he was born Dwayne Ralph Hall, and after he was arrested, he tried to enlist in the Navy, where his brothers and his uncles were in the Navy, and it was building up to World War II, and then he was rejected when they found out he was arrested for being gay. The Navy would not accept him, even though it was wartime. Oh, wow. And so he changed his name. He switched his first and last name and applied to the Army, and they accepted him. I don't know if it was because of a name change, but he forever would be Ralph Dwayne, even though all his family members called him Dwayne. We just grew up thinking every dad had two names. So yeah, it was the horrors that I learned, like how much that man endured in his lifetime. He got a job. He was working in for a plumbing contractor on the peninsula when I was little, and this was a big buildup of housing in the Bay Area. All the defense jobs, all the returning soldiers, and he made a lot of money. We got bigger and bigger houses, fancier things, whatever. And then the housing boom collapsed, and he actually left that. He was a partner, and he left. He needed to get another job, and he got one. At a good one at the VA hospital in San Francisco. And he did a really good job there. He was always like a really good office manager, numbers, and they even accused him of being one of those efficiency experts. Maybe most of you don't know that term at the time. And then 3 months later, he was fired when the Civil Service Commission found out he was gay from his arrest. So that plunged my family into bankruptcy. I was taken out of private school, put into public school, a large public school, halfway through my freshman year. I didn't put all those pieces together until after my father died. Mostly just a lot of, sadness and anger about what happened. And then grateful too, like for how good of parents they both were, despite all of this. I don't know if I could have done that.
Yeah. I think, a little bit of feedback there. I think a really good place to kind of close things out for the evening is, you said that one of the last things that you spoke about with your father was, if he had, what the biggest regrets in his life were, which was that he said he didn't try harder to live a life with Stanley. If you could imagine, if your father kind of let himself be who he was without that fear behind it, and still, manage to have a life with you, with your mother, with your family, what do you imagine that would look like, and what do you wish he would have been around to see?
Well, I think I'll answer that in a roundabout way, because after I finished my book, I was walking up the hill here in San Francisco, walking home, and this vision came to me. And it was of my father and Stanley together, married, happy. I mean, I saw the whole thing in the 12 minutes it took me to walk up the hill. It just came to me. And I was in high school in this vision, and I was doing my homework, and my dad walked in the door, and the first thing he did was go to Stanley. Now, in our family, the first thing he did was come to the kids, which sounds really great, but it also puts a pretty big burden on the kids, right? You want them to have the parents to be the main, to have a really strong bond. And I, for the first time in my life, in this 12 minutes, I felt like what it would feel like to be the child of two parents who were in love. And it was a healing thing. I mean, I never knew that feeling. And I knew it in that vision. Like, it was so warm. It wasn't exactly what you asked. I guess I keep doing that, but
I think that fits.
Okay. Yeah, I've never had such a warm feeling. I've always been, really insecure because of the bond between my parents was so tenuous. But it wasn't. So I know what it's like to be a child with parents, the same-sex parents who are in love. And it felt wonderful.
Well, I think that's a really lovely sentiment to kind of close things out on this evening. Laura, I really thank you for sharing your story and for sharing the book and all of these wonderful photos with us. For those of you who have been joining us this evening, if you don't already have the book, you can get Affliction on our bookshop.org page. If you go to bookshop.org/shop/GLBT history, you'll find it on our author events list. And if you purchase the book there, not only do you get to support the Society and Laura at the same time, we get, a couple of cents for every book that's sold. But if you go ahead and send an email to me here's my work email at glbthistory.org. And if you send me your receipt as well as your confirmation that you reserved a ticket for this evening, Laura has graciously offered to send signed book plates to folks. So feel free to send that in. Please do it by the end of Monday if you can. And I really hope that we get to kind of hear more from you. I wish you all the success for this book. And if you want to check out, kind of the origins, we have Laura's website, mydadscloset.com, which is the kind of blog that things started out from. And I hope that you, Laura, have a wonderful evening and weekend. And I hope that everyone who's watching does as well. So we'll say good night and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks so much, Lee. Thanks to everyone here.